Okie doke. We left off on chapter 36. Do you not realize how dangerous this is? The king continued. If the emperor were ever to know you were... What did you hear? Well, we heard you read the paper of answers, Yishan told him. The king drew a sharp breath. Then you must leave as soon as possible, he said. The emperor would have you killed for just knowing I have the paper. Well, how do you even have the paper? Penmai asked, her curiosity stronger than her timidity. I thought it was given away. Oh, that's a very complicated story, the king said. I'm not sure if I even understand it, much less believe it. What do you mean? Nishan asked, and the king hesitated. Do either of you know the story of how the first king of the city of bright moonlight's father turned into a tiger? The story of the green tiger? Penmai said instantly. Of course. Well, I don't, Yishan said. So tell me. The king waved his hand at Penmai. I would be interested in hearing your version of the story, he said. So with that, Penmai began. The story of the green tiger. A long time ago, even before the time of my grandmother, the emperor called all the kings of the land to his spring festival celebration. At the palace, he presented to each of the kings a small seed. Each of you is to plant and care for your seed as if it were your kingdom, said the emperor. At the moon festival, you are to bring your plant to me. Hi, Tristan. I'm glad you're here. Those with the best flowers will be rewarded, but if any of you fail to bring me a plant... The emperor didn't even need to finish his sentence. All the kings had all thrown themselves into kowtows, each swearing he would return at the moon festival with splendid flowers. One by one, they left, each taking his precious seed with him. The young king of the city of bright moonlight returned home to find his father waiting for him. The father had once been a powerful magistrate, but had fallen out of favor and was bitterly living at the palace. When the son told him of the emperor's task, the father was excited. You must grow the magnificent flower, the father commanded. This is your opportunity to return me to power. The young king did not disagree, and he planted the seed with great care in a pot. Faithfully, he watered and waited and watered and waited for the seed to sprout. Maya can probably relate to that with her herb garden. But unlike Maya, nothing grew. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and still the pot was bare. The king replanted the seed and called the best gardeners of his land to consult, but still nothing grew. Throughout this, the king's father wore a frown that seemed to become permanent on his face. He had sent spies to neighboring kingdoms and heard rumors of orchids, peonies, and lilies. Yet his son had only a dirt-filled pot. If nothing grew by the moon festival, the king's father thought, this chance would be lost, and considering the emperor's ire, perhaps even worse. So when there was still no plant growing in the pot, a month before the moon festival, the father confronted his son on his nightly stroll through the garden. You will have to leave for the imperial palace soon, the father said, but your pot is bare." The king nodded. In his hands was a piece of paper. The father recognized it as the paper he himself had given him as a wedding gift. "I've prepared another pot for you," the father said. "In secret, I had the gardener grow a rare moonflower. It is the finest flower ever seen. You can bring that instead." The king was silent, and for a long moment he stared out at the lake before him. "Thank you, Father, for your consideration," the king said finally. "But I think I'll take the bare pot instead." "You don't understand," the father said impatiently. "The king of the city of Winding River has grown a red peony so bright it looks like it's on fire. The king of the city of far clouds has an orchid with the fragrance of a sweet apple." "Hi, Anna." "All the kings will have flowers in their pots. What are you going to say to the emperor when you have none?" "Well, I guess I'll just tell the emperor that I tried my best to grow his seed," the king said, "but nothing grew. I think I should tell him the truth." "Are you crazy?" his father said. "Do you know what the emperor will do? He will take away your kingdom. He might even execute you just for the insult." "Well, that might be," the king said, "but I can't lie. It would be found out eventually, so I think I should go with my own pot." No, I can make sure no one finds out," the father said. "I will have the gardener and his whole family killed and throw away all who may know into a dungeon." The young king blanched at his father's words and looked at the paper in his hands. "Father," the king said without looking up, "I'm going to take my bare pot." "Don't be a fool," his father snapped. "You must bring a flower or I will never return to power." The king gave a wry smile at those last words, a smile the father didn't understand. As the paper in the king's hand flapped like a nervous butterfly, the father got angrier and angrier. "Why are you looking at that paper?" the father growled. "What are you reading?" The king looked up with reluctance. He glanced at the moon, its reflection wavering in the lake, and he glanced at the murky green water rippling in uneasy waves. "Well, it says 3 things can long be hidden: the sun, the moon," the king said slowly, holding the paper for his father to see, "and the truth. The truth can't long be hidden." This, the father gasped. "Is that a cursed paper that is giving you this idiotic advice?" he cried. "You are listening more to that infernal piece of paper than to your own father." The father gave an infuriated roar and grabbed the paper from his son, seizing it with such force that he fell backward into the lake, shattering the reflection of the moon. The paper slipped from his fingers, and almost as if it were a fish, it floated over his face. The father thrashed and flailed, clawing to peel the paper from his face, but as he struggled to lift the paper, he realized he no longer had hands. His hands had turned to paws, and his skin was wet fur, the same color as the murky water. His clothes writhed around him until they finally twisted off, and when at last the paper fell away, he knew his face had changed as well. The young king gaped in shock, and the father was only able to see why when the reflection of the moon returned to the lake, for he had turned into a tiger. And that is the story of the green tiger. Wait, Yishan interrupted. I thought that the first king of the city of bright moonlight exiled his father. He did, Pinmai said. He had to. When his father turned into a tiger, the first king couldn't let him stay in the city. He was too dangerous. So his father was exiled, meaning he was kicked out and never allowed to come back. So it was a tiger? It was as a tiger that he was exiled? Yishan said, scratching his head and looking up as if trying to read a lost memory in the night sky. I guess that would make sense. If you believe the story, that is, the king interjected. There are many parts of that story that I find doubtful. But what does this have to do with the paper? Pinmai asked. The paper turned the first king's father into a tiger, but that was way before the paper was given away. So how could you have the paper now? It was my father, the former king of the city of bright moonlight, who gave the paper away over 60 years ago, the king said. After he abdicated and became quite old, he returned to the palace with the paper and a strange story. Pinmai looked at Yishan, but he did not meet her eyes. Instead, he was still gazing upward. Another star was flying across the sky, making a silver scratch on the black lacquered night. Pinmai frowned and turned back to the king. Does it have something to do with the green tiger? She asked. Yes, the king said. I suppose it could be considered a new part of the green tiger story. A new part of the story of the green tiger? Pinmai repeated, giving Yishan a sharp nudge. He glanced at her apologetically. I didn't know there was a new part. Please, Your Majesty, I would like to hear the story. The new part of the story of the green tiger. My father, in his old age, had taken to traveling in disguise to enjoy the pleasures of common life. You guys remember disguise, one of our vocab words? Like when you change your appearance so that people can't recognize you. Maybe you put on a wig and sunglasses or a hat or something. So one night, on one of my father's trips, he decided to go for a night walk and found himself by a lake so large and black he could not tell where the water ended and the sky began. In fact, he would not have even known it was a lake at all if it wasn't for the giant moon that was reflected in the water. It was a beautiful sight, and he sat down to admire it. As he rested, he began to hear a strange sound. A loud splashing echoed in the air, and a giant beast burst from the lake as if ripping through a paper moon. Sorry, my computer glitched, but I paused. I'm going to say that sentence again. A loud splashing echoed in the air, and a giant beast burst from the lake as if it was ripping through a paper moon. The beast crawled out of the lake, and when it reached the shore, it panted and gasped, exhausted. My father said he had never seen a more wretched and disgusting creature. A hard journey, was it not? A voice said. There was an old man speaking to the beast. He was a man with a long gray beard, who my father insisted came from nowhere. He just appeared, my father said. The miserable beast did nothing but give a low, pitiful moan. Mm. Do you wonder why I am here? The old man said. Or why you were finally able to free yourself from your prison of the well to this lake? The beast finally raised his head, and my father gasped. It was a tiger. Your son did a great service for us, the man said, waving his hand toward the moon. And his dying wish was to have you return. It is only now, after you have reached your 5th year of the tiger without creating harm, that we can finally fulfill his wish. My father watched all this, mesmerized, as the old man took a paper out of his sleeve. He dipped it in the water and bent over the trembling tiger. I fear I will regret this, the man said. You do not seem to learn from your past mistakes. And with that, he placed the wet paper on the animal's face. The tiger shuddered, and my father watched as the old man stood up and turned toward the water. Strangely, as the old man stepped onto the lake, he didn't sink, but he walked straight onto the path of moonlight reflected on the water. When my father looked back at the tiger, the beast was reaching for the paper on his face, but the beast's claws had transformed into fingers. And when the paper was finally peeled off, the tiger was a man. The man who had been a beast stood, stared at the departing figure walking toward the moon, and then dropped the paper as if it was diseased. The paper floated in the air like a white butterfly, and it landed in my father's lap. The man saw my father holding the paper and gave an inhuman roar and leaped in the opposite direction. He ran on his hands and feet as if he were still an animal, my father said. I knew who he was and what he had been. He had been the green tiger. And that is the new part of the story of the green tiger. The green tiger, Pinwai gasped. The first king's father turned back into a man? He could be the emperor. No, the king said. That's impossible. How could the first king's father, be him man or beast, be alive for so long? The first king was generations before even my own father's time. For the first king's father to be alive, he would have to be an immortal. And we all know the emperor is not immortal. At least not yet, Yishan added darkly. He was no longer distracted by the sky and was, instead, staring intensely at the king. Then your father's story, Pinwai began. My father was very old and often mixed dreams with reality, the king said. Once he dreamed he was a butterfly, and when he woke up, he thought he was a butterfly, dreaming he was a man. There's no doubt this story was probably confused as well. But the paper, Pinwai insisted. You have the paper. Well, part of his story was probably true, the king agreed, for it is the paper of answers. I spent many long years learning how to read it. And now you use that knowledge to help the emperor? Yishan said, and the anger in his tone surprised Pinwai. Even if the emperor is not the green tiger, he's just as bad. He's using whatever you tell him to gain more power, kill more people, and now live forever. How dare you use the paper to help him? Well, what would you have me do? The king said. I'm a prisoner in my own palace, and spies surround me. How could I do anything else? Yishan glared, and the king looked back defiantly, almost as if he were the small child and Yishan the adult. The wind whined, its cold breath freezing them into two scowling statues. Stroking Ama's bracelet desperately, Pinwai glanced from one to the other. The smooth jade soothed her cold, cracked fingers, and she was surprised when she heard her own voice speaking. Your Majesty, Pinhai said, her quiet words loud in the silence. I did not finish my story. Can I tell you the end? The end of the story of the Green Tiger. After the shock of his father's transformation was over, the young king looked at the moonflower his father had prepared. It was indeed a beautiful plant. The king gazed at it and looked at his own pot, full of only dirt, and shook his head. On the day of the moon festival, the king of the city of bright moonlight arrived at the imperial palace with his bare pot. As he passed each gorgeous peony and peach blossom, every elegant chrysanthemum and lily, he heard horrified murmurs. And the dismay was justified, for when the emperor saw the king's pot, his face turned as black as iron. What is this? Demanded the emperor. A bare pot? Whose is this? It's mine, the young king said, as he prostrated himself on the floor. I will strip you of your kingdom for your insult, the emperor bellowed. How dare you? I'm sorry, your exalted majesty, the king said, flattening himself even lower to the ground. I tried my best to grow your seed, but nothing grew. Ha! You could not grow a simple seed? How stupid are you? The emperor barked. He looked at the king before him and the vibrant flowers surrounding him. Orange and vermilion, magenta and gold, the colors of the flowers blazed like flames. Tell me, the emperor said in a slightly different tone, do you not have a better excuse than that? Did not your unskilled gardener destroy the plant? Or perhaps one of your rival kings poisoned your soil? No, your exalted majesty, the king said. I was just unable to grow the seed. Answer carefully, young king, the emperor said in a menacing tone, for your life may depend on the answer. Who is to blame for this empty pot? The king raised his head. His face was white, but he said without hesitation, I am. The room gasped, and all expected the emperor to call his guards to drag the king away. But instead, the emperor smiled and stood and motioned for the young king to stand. All bow to him, the emperor ordered. Bow to the greatest king in my empire. The other kings were confused, but they did as they were told, and they all lowered their heads. Only the bravest and most virtuous of men would dare to bring me a bare pot, the emperor said, as well as refuse to blame someone else. You are a man of great honor. I don't understand, said the king. No one could have grown a flower from the seeds I gave, the emperor said. I boiled them. And that is the end of the story of the Green Tiger. When Pinmai finished her story, the silence returned, but it was a gentle quiet, without resentment. For a long moment, the king looked out, past the stone sculpture to the frozen lake, and then he bowed his head to Yishan. You are right, he said in a low voice. If my ancestors knew how I had helped the emperor, they would be very ashamed. As he raised his head, Pinmai glimpsed his haunted eyes and saw how broken he was by worry and regret. She forgot he was king, and she touched his arm gently. He looked at her, and his anguished eyes softened. He patted her hand with gratitude, the soft snowflakes landing on them like resting stars. And just then, A strange twittering filled the air. Pinmai's face yanked skyward. It was Lady Meng's swallow, and running in the distance, Lady Meng. They rushed to her as she clutched at them. Yana sent me, she gasped. Told me the Emperor, soldiers, guards. There was a twang in the air and a high-pitched shriek. Something fell from the sky. Pinmai looked down. At Yishan's feet was a mussel with the tip of a soldier's arrow in it. And that is where we stop for today.